Tractate Temurah covers the various laws of substituting temple offerings for alternative animals. Chapter 1 will begin discussion on these laws. The first Mishnah says, all people can substitute offerings, both men and women. This doesn't mean that a person is allowed to do so. Such a thing is actually forbidden. It just means that if somebody did this, it's effective, and he gets lashes for impermissibly substituting an offering. This is as the verse states, he shall not distinguish between good and bad, nor shall he substitute for it. And if he does substitute for it, then it and its substitute shall be holy, it may not be redeemed. Meaning it's prohibited to do so, but there are still laws that apply if it's done. The Gemara clarifies, this substituting is impermissible, although it would be effective only after the fact. It said all can do this substitution, to include heirs doing so for their father's offering. Some say this isn't actually permissible, as they say it's derived from smicha, leaning on an offering, which isn't permitted for an heir to do at the end of the consecration process, so similarly, an heir can't substitute an offering at the beginning of consecration. It also sources that an heir does not lean on his father's offering, at least according to this disputing opinion. It's argued if this opinion holds that joint owners of an offering need to lean with smicha on it, and it additionally sources the opinions which say an heir actually can substitute an offering, as they say that just as an offering can be substituted at the beginning of consecration, so too an heir must lean on his father's offering at the end. It additionally sources how we know a woman is subject to these laws of offering substitutions. It is asked if a minor can viably substitute an offering, at least by one who's old enough to make a vow, so he can consecrate an animal in the first place, as on the one hand he can consecrate the animal, but he's also not subject to punishments. And based on this, can a non-Jewish person substitute an offering, as they can consecrate animals, which it then sources. However, on the other hand, a non-Jewish man is not subject to our court punishments of lashes, while a minor eventually will be once he gets older, so perhaps there's a difference. It said they cannot substitute an offering if it's being used to atone for a non-Jewish man. If it's being used to atone for a Jewish man, that's disputed, as to if we go after the consecrator or the man being atoned, so that's left largely unresolved. It said that by a non-Jewish man's offering, their offering cannot be benefited from, like by all other offerings, but that's actually a rabbinic institution, so there's no actual liability for the violation of me'ilah. There's also no liability for improper intent, leftovers, or eating while impure by their offerings, which it sources, and that their offerings aren't substituted also, which is additionally sourced, and also that they don't bring plain libations, but their animal offerings would require a libation, which it also sources. However, it is said by some, the best method is to be stringent and just treat a non-Jewish man's temple offering the exact same way a Jewish man's temple offering is treated. So, some say by a non-Jewish man's items that are consecrated for temple upkeep, there would actually be me'ilah for benefiting from them, as those have monetary sanctity, so they aren't comparable to offering substitution. Regarding the punishment of lashes, some say the only way a punishment of lashes is ever given is if it involved an actual physical act. Evidently, our Mishnah disagrees with this, at least in this respect, as they say there's lashes for substituting an animal offering, which doesn't involve an actual action. Some say there's just exceptions to the principle that lashes are only given to a transgression with a real action, as they'd say lashes also apply by somebody who takes a false oath, somebody who curses another with God's name, somebody who substituted an offering, and others. It spent some time sourcing these individually, and it disputes what the exact case by the false oath is. Some say it's similar to a vain oath, so essentially for somebody swearing that he ate when he actually hadn't, but it wouldn't include a false oath about a future event, like somebody who swears to eat a loaf of bread and then intentionally doesn't. However, a later source implies that a false oath about a past event actually wouldn't have lashes. It would require an offering in accordance with a disputing opinion. Anyways, some said substituting an animal would actually incur lashes, as they say that his speech accomplishes an action. It sources the fact that cursing another with God's name would incur lashes. Some even said that if somebody separates Terumah tithes before the first fruit tithes, he's liable for lashes, which it additionally cites verses on to source. Although this one is actually subject to dispute, as some say there would be no lashes here, and it quotes who exactly holds these individual opinions. And in spite of the fact that this has speech, which we said was enough to cause lashes by an animal substitution, this perhaps wouldn't, as this concept of separating the Terumah tithes before the first fruit tithe is uniquely a prohibition that could be resolved through a positive commandment, which has been established to not have lashes by such a sin. By an offering substitution, there is actually a positive commandment to fix it, but there's still lashes, as it has two transgressions. Related, if a Kohen violates a woman and then marries and then divorces her, he receives lashes, even though that's a prohibition that could be resolved with the positive commandment, but that's just because he's a Kohen, so it's stricter. Anyways, it further disputes as to whether there's lashes for a transgression that doesn't involve an action from some additional particular examples, such as by the paschal offering being left over and similar. Related, if there's a prohibition against an action, and somebody does this, some say his action was effective, hence the punishment for doing so, of lashes, while others say his action was ineffective, and he would be punished simply for violating a commandment from God. So it goes through a whole bunch of different examples to try and determine which way we hold like. For example, if somebody violated a woman, married her, and then divorced her, that's prohibited. There's lashes. So this works according to those that say the action was effective, and those that say it's not effective say the transgression comes from the fact that he's under a constant obligation to remarry her. There's variation on this quoted. There's the prohibition mentioned against separating inferior produce as the terumah tithe for superior quality produce. However, that's unique, as a verse specifies that one is called a sinner for doing so. Also, by terumah, it's prohibited to separate one type of food for a different type. So that's another action that's illegal and is considered to be ineffective. But again, that's uniquely based on a verse. Again, by certain consecration vows, they're said to be ineffective if they're done impermissibly. So this is again based on a verse, as it's compared to the bechor tithe. Fine, again, by terumah tithes, it cannot be substituted, but it's effective and there's lashes for doing so. So this would contradict the opinion that says a forbidden action is ineffective. But again, this has a unique status based on verses. But by the bechor firstborn tithe, it said it cannot be redeemed, implying that a forbidden action is ineffective. So again, that's unique based on verses that are discussed at further length. By the Meiser offering, it said it cannot be redeemed. Again, apparently an impermissible action is ineffective, and it's said to be different as it's compared to the bechor offering. Fine, what about the concept of separating the terumah tithe before the bikurim first fruits, which is said to be valid, disproving the other opinion that says an impermissible action is not effective. So once again, it has a unique status, which is described. By a widow marrying a Kohen Gadol, it said the betrothal is effective, yet impermissible. Again, it's a unique exception. By the case of consecrating blemished offerings, that's said to be valid and impermissible. Again, it's a unique exception based on verses. By consecrating unblemished animals towards temple upkeep, that's impermissible and effective, as it's the same way blemished animals are sanctified even if they're designated to be offered on the altar. By the prohibition against stealing, there's a requirement for repayment, but there's still acquisition, only that's an impermissible effective act, so that's explained to be unique as it's only returned if it hasn't undergone any changes. There's a prohibition against illegally taking collateral, although it's said to be effective, again that's a unique exception. By not leaving Peah, field charity, it's said to be ineffective if somebody violated this. And once again, it's explained to be an exception based on a verse. The actual dispute between these opinions as to whether an impermissible act is effective or not is specifically by prearranged interest on a loan, which is of course prohibited, as it's a dispute if this is effective as to whether it must then be returned. Others disagree and say this is actually a dispute that's not on this principal argument, it's based on some verses. So actually, it's explained, there's just literally no practical case where there's a difference between these two opinions. It's just how they'd respond differently to all of the past suggested cases over the past few pages. There's variation on this conversation. It also additionally sources the principle that a consecrated blemished animal cannot be used as an offering, and it further covers principles on the Azazel he-goat offering, explaining that a blemished animal cannot be consecrated as such an offering. There are about 5 prohibitions violated if somebody consecrates a blemished animal: to not consecrate it, to not slaughter it, to not throw its blood, to not burn all of it, and to not burn part of it. Now, some add a 6th, to not receive the blood, which they then source, and it discusses some variation on this conversation. It also says these prohibitions against consecrating a blemished animal apply from when it was blemished after its birth. Some suggest there's no prohibition against consecrating an animal that was blemished from birth, as we presume that he only meant to consecrate its value, but that's disputed. Some say there's uniquely a prohibition, as unlike consecrating wood or similar, this is actually disrespectful. This would mean even if the blemished animal was sold to have the proceeds used for libations, there would be lashes, as again, it's disrespectful. It further proves this principle. New Mishnah. The Kohanim can substitute offerings with their own consecrated animals, and Yisraelim can substitute with their own consecrated animals. Kohanim cannot substitute a Chatas, an Asham, or a Bechor that were given by a Yisrael. This is as a Bechor is a Kohanic gift, just like the Chatas and Asham, and we know they can't substitute a Chatas or Asham, so they can't do so to a Bechor. By the Chatas and Asham, the Kohen doesn't receive any monetary rights to the animals, unlike by a Bechor, but they're still comparable, as they all had their sanctity begin when the Yisrael owner had them. The Gemara says, it's taught that a Bechor can be sold by a Kohen if it's alive and unblemished, and if it's blemished, whether it's alive or dead, the Kohen can still use it, even to betroth a woman, for example. This is explained to apply nowadays when the Kohen gets the monetary rights to an animal. When the temple stands, it's offered in the temple, so the Kohen can't sell it. It quotes a case that's explained to say the same principle. Again, it quotes a few other similar cases that are explained to be in accordance with this established principle. These are additionally discussed. However, some suggest that it's actually disputed as to whether a live, unblemished Bechor, firstborn during the temple era, if the Kohen can have the monetary rights to such an animal. We said the Kohen can sell the unblemished Bechor while it's alive, according to some. This is clarified to only be allowed for a Kohen to sell it to another Kohen, as if a Yisrael was purchasing it, it would resemble a Kohen assisting with threshing to receive terumah tithes, which is a wrong thing to do. It quotes some relevant cases on this. New Mishnah. A person can make a substituted offering of sheep or goat for cattle, or vice versa, or of goats for sheep, of a male for a female, or vice versa, or of unblemished animals for blemished animals, or vice versa. Of course, the verse for this last one, as it says, the animal could be substituted bad for good, meaning an unblemished animal can be substituted for a blemished one. The Gemara further sources these remaining points about the validity of substituting all the other types of animals, which are discussed at length. The case of substituting one's own animal with somebody else's animal must be with a general consecrated animal and one's own unconsecrated animal. So if the consecrated animal's owner said anybody can substitute with theirs if they want to, then this man could do so. New Mishnah. Somebody can make a substitution for one animal with two animals, or 2 for 1, or even 1 for 100, or 100 for 1. Some disagree and say one animal can only be substituted with one animal, as is implied by the verse. The Gemara further disputes the sources between these opinions as to whether the singular or plural word for animals are used. According to the opinion that it can only be a substitution of 1 for 1, there's a dispute if he'd hold a single animal can be repeatedly consecrated, which it then disputes. Also, according to his opinion, by an asham offering for atonement that was substituted, and then the original offering became blemished, so it was deconsecrated and redeemed for another animal, and then the replacement was lost, so he atoned through a new replacement animal, and then the original was found. Can he then resubstitute this animal as the original was substituted? And he says you can only substitute once, but it was replaced, so it's a different animal. So this is a double question, as it's a different animal and a different degree of sanctity, so that stands unresolved. There's another variation of this whole conversation that's quoted. Related to this topic, it said if somebody redeems property that has primary sanctity, a fifth is added. If it's secondary sanctity, meaning it's from a pre-existing source, a fifth is not added. That's sourced. So if somebody designates an asham offering to atone and it was blemished, so he adds a fifth and redeems it onto another animal, and the replacement was lost, so he was atoned through a new animal, and the lost animal was found and was designated as an ola instead, and then that was blemished and needs to be redeemed as it switched offering types, but it's technically a secondary sanctity. So would a fifth be added here? Again, this is a double question, as it has these two factors of the differing bodies and the differing levels of sanctity. Again, that's unresolved, and it then quotes a variant of this entire discussion. If somebody consecrated his own animal for somebody else's atonement, and the animal was blemished, so it now requires redemption, we said a fifth is added, and it's done by the man who actually sanctified the item, not by the one who was atoned through it. However, the one who was atoned is considered the owner to be able to substitute it, which it further sources. New Mishnah. In regards to substituting an offering, it's not allowed to substitute unconsecrated limbs for consecrated animal fetuses, and you can't substitute unconsecrated fetuses for consecrated limbs. Also, unconsecrated fetuses or limbs cannot be substituted for consecrated whole animals, or vice versa. Some say it would be valid to substitute unconsecrated limbs for consecrated whole animals, but not vice versa. This is as normally if somebody designates the leg of an animal as an ola, that's valid, and it would make the entire animal an ola. So too, somebody can substitute an unconsecrated animal leg to an entire consecrated animal. The Gemara disputes as to whether an animal fetus can be consecrated if it's by itself, as some say such a thing can have a sanctified status, and others disagree. Those that say it can have such a status say that if somebody consecrated a pregnant animal as a Chatas and it gave birth, he can be atoned either through the animal or its offspring. This is additionally mentioned, as he's not even consecrating the fetus here, he consecrated the pregnant mother. It quotes a variation of this discussion. We said there's a dispute if an animal fetus can be consecrated. Some would concede that it could still have monetary sanctity, and also that such a status would prevent it from getting the sanctity of being the firstborn. It further quotes cases disputing as to whether an animal fetus alone can acquire physical sanctity. It additionally disputes between these opinions. In the end, it concedes that an unblemished fetus in the womb of an unblemished animal can be physically consecrated. The dispute only exists by an unblemished fetus inside of a blemished animal, as there it's a dispute as to whether or not the fetus has the same status of its blemished mother. There's variation of this discussion that's quoted. Now, there was that opinion which stated by a consecrated animal, if somebody designates its leg as an ola, the whole animal is an ola. It mentions this is actually a disputed point. Some say this would only apply if a vital individual limb was consecrated, that it would then spread to the entire animal. Although it is agreed if the consecrated organ was something that, if removed, would give the animal a defect, or according to others, possibly would make it improperly slaughtered, or according to others, possibly that it would kill the animal, it's fully sanctified. These variations dispute as to essentially whether something with a defect can live or not, and whether, if the animal's thigh is removed, whether that makes it have the status of improperly slaughtered. So essentially it's one of these three options that's something which the soul is dependent on, and it's agreed if such an organ is consecrated, the whole animal would also be. By a bird that only part of it is consecrated, that's unresolved. Also, if a single limb of an animal was consecrated for its monetary value, do we say that the whole animal has monetary sanctity, or do we say that and then it would have physical sanctity? So that is also unresolved. Further, if a single limb was consecrated, it's unresolved as to whether the prohibition against shearing a consecrated animal would apply to the whole thing. If an animal's skin was consecrated, it argues if the animal can still be worked with, as it's definitely rabbinically prohibited, but as to whether it's even biblically prohibited, that's unresolved. If a pregnant animal was consecrated as a shlomim offering, excluding the fetus, and it was slaughtered inside the temple, according to those that would say the fetus would only be consecrated once it's actually born, would this constitute slaughtering an unconsecrated animal inside the temple? It's explained there would be no problem here. Also, if the animal was unconsecrated but the fetus was a shlomim and it was slaughtered outside the temple, again, there would be no issue of slaughtering the consecrated fetus outside the temple when the mother is killed. New Mishnah. Produce of a forbidden mixture of terumah tithes and regular foods don't create a new forbidden mixture when mixed with other regular foods, unless the actual terumah exceeds 1/100th of the mixture. If regular dough and leavened terumah dough mix, they don't make another amount of dough leavened by the terumah unless the original terumah exceeds this 1/100th of the mixture. Drawn water cannot disqualify a mikveh except according to this calculation. The purification of a red heifer only becomes purification waters once the ashes are placed on them. A plowed graveyard cannot be plowed further to extend its impurity into other fields. Terumah cannot be separated from terumah. It is a dispute if the offspring of a consecrated animal can substitute for it. The Gemara describes who authored this based on individually held opinions. We said a regular dough and terumah mixture cannot leaven other doughs as terumah unless it exceeds its terumah ratio. Others actually disagree and say that it just goes by whatever fell in last. The remaining points are explained. When it says drawn water doesn't disqualify a mikveh, it actually means except according to the ratio of vessels, as it said that if 3 lugan measures of drawn water fall into a mikveh, if they contain 2 or 3 vessels of drawn water, they disqualify the mikveh. If it was more than this, it would be fine. It sources the opinion who holds that the purification of the red heifer is by the placement of the ashes, which must be done after the water is placed in the vessel, as he holds the water as a non-essential aspect. Again, there's a disagreeing opinion which says a plowed graveyard field can actually be extended further, and it sources who holds terumah cannot be taken from terumah, along with the remaining points. New Mishnah. Bird and mincha offerings cannot be substituted, as the verse which discusses substitution speaks only of animals. A community and partners cannot substitute an offering, only an individual can do so. Animals consecrated for temple upkeep cannot be substituted. Verses are quoted. The Gemara additionally elaborates on these sources at length. These are additionally discussed, and that's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Tractate Temurah covers further laws of temple offerings. The first Mishnah says there are some unique differences between personal and communal temple offerings. Personal offerings can be substituted. Personal offerings can be male or females, while communal offerings are always males. Personal offerings must be brought even once their designated time has passed, and the owner needs to always offer the accompanying libations, while those don't apply by the communal offering, although they would need to offer the libations once the offering has already been brought. Communal offerings are unique, as they override the laws of Shabbos and the laws of impurity. Rabbi Meir actually holds that the Kohen Gadol's daily mincha and the Yom Kippur bowl Chatas are private offerings, and they override the Shabbos and impurity, so he says it's that any offering which has a fixed time overrides the Shabbos and holidays. The Gemara says, actually, personal bird offerings cannot be substituted, but our Mishnah was just discussing animal offerings, and this is like the opinion that an animal's offspring can be a replacement. Also, our Mishnah only discusses primary offerings, which is why we didn't mention the inability to substitute a substitution, which actually also answers the prior question about offspring. We said personal offerings, unlike communal offerings, can be male or female. The olah must be a male, but the bird olah can also be a female. A chatas must be a female, but the nasi's goat offering must be a male. And we don't discuss asham offerings, as there are no communal asham variants. Or it's just that the Mishnah is saying that there is such thing as a personal offering that could be offered as a male or a female, which would be the shlomim offering. We said by the personal offering, if the designated time passes, the owner needs to replace it. We source this and the remaining principles. A source seems to say that the libations can be offered at night, which isn't true, so it explains it refers to libations that are brought by themselves, which can be brought by night, not libations brought with offerings. On the topic of libations, some show how they're juxtaposed in a verse to the Shlomim offering, which teaches that both must be brought by day, as mentioned. That's described further. some relevant verses on this are discussed. New Mishnah. A private Chatas whose owner instead was atoned through a different offering, the Chatas must be left to die. A communal Chatas whose owner was instead atoned through a different offering, it's a dispute if it's left to die. It quotes a support for the opinion which says it's not, as this, the laws of substitution, and others are only done by personal offerings. The Gemara quotes the source for the fact that once a second animal is offered, the original designated animal is not offered. Some say it should be left to graze, others say it must be left to die. Those that say it must be left to graze is where it was lost and found before the replacement was offered, or it's that both opinions are where the original Chatas was lost and found before the replacement was offered, and they just hold differing opinions. The source is the differing opinion that says a communal Chatas whose owners were atoned is actually left to die, along with some related discussions. It also speaks on the greatness of a number of particular sages throughout history, and that as time went on, our knowledge has declined and been forgotten, and that our leaders from a certain point onwards all have had their own sort of flaws. Many laws were even forgotten after Moshe's passing. It said 3,000 laws were forgotten in his period of mourning, and it was asked of Joshua and Samuel to teach new things, but they said after Moshe, the Torah cannot be changed and no new laws can be introduced. It said one of these forgotten laws was on the status of a Chatas whose owner died, as to what the status is in such a case, which is relevant as that's one of the things we're discussing here. It said that when Moshe left to enter the Garden of Eden, he told Joshua to ask him any uncertainties he had on the Torah, and Joshua said essentially that he knew everything, so Moshe was very upset due to his students' apparent lack of humility, and hundreds of laws were then forgotten by Joshua, and everybody became upset, so they had to then go to a war. Although it is said that through the analysis of many sages, a lot of these old laws have been restored. It expounded a number of related verses, speaking on the greatness of figures like Kalev, Osniel, or Yabitz, and many others, and it teaches that if somebody dedicates himself to Torah study, God will grant his requests. It expounds further on the proof that a communal offering where the owners were atoned through a different animal, the animal is not left to die. That's discussed. New Mishnah. There's a stringency of consecrated animals over substituted animals, as a consecrated animal can become substituted, that a community and partner can together consecrate an animal, and an animal fetus or individual limb can be consecrated. All of these do not apply by animal substitutions. There are some stringencies of offering substitutions over consecrated animals. A substituted animal can become sanctified even if it's permanently blemished, and it cannot become deconsecrated to be sheared or worked with. Also, according to some, an unintentional act is considered like an intentional act by an offering substitution. There is no difference between a substituted and consecrated animal in that a mixed breed or a defected animal or an animal born by a C-section and a tumtum and androgynous cannot become sanctified, and they cannot sanctify others by substitution. The Gemara says, when it's said by animal substitutions that an unintentional act is like an intentional one, that the case here is that the man thought that it is permitted to substitute an offering, or he thought it was permitted to consecrate a blemished animal for the altar, so this would be valid by the substitution and there would be lashes, but not to by the consecration. Alternatively, it just means that if somebody meant to substitute the animal and accidentally said it's substituted as a shlomim, if he did this substitution, it's valid and there's lashes. If he did this with a blemished animal by sanctification, there's no lashes. Alternatively, the case is that somebody said that this animal should lose its sanctity and this one should gain it, not realizing that that's a prohibited act of substitution. So again, lashes. And if the equivalent of this was done by consecrating a blemished animal, nothing happens. Last alternative, somebody entered a house planning on substituting or consecrating an animal knowingly, and then accidentally did this unknowingly. There'd be lashes for the substitution and nothing for the ineffective consecration. By a mixed breed, a defect, a C-section, or an otherwise animal, it is said that it cannot become sanctified through substitution, and they cannot substitute for others. This is explained as they can attain their initial sanctity by being the offspring of consecrated animals, but they cannot then go and produce a substitution. This is as this opinion likens these variants to non-kosher animals, so the same principles between these would apply. A blemished animal can be substituted, as it's not like a non-kosher animal, as its type is permitted for consumption. Related, it said if somebody consecrated an animal with a defect, some say it does create physical sanctity and must be then left to die, while others say it's the equivalent of trying to consecrate a rock, so it only attains monetary sanctity and can be redeemed. It quotes cases to dispute between these opinions. And that's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Tractate Temurah continues covering the various laws of substituting animal offerings in regards to offspring. The first Mishnah says there are consecrated animals whose offspring and also their substitutions have the exact same status as the original offering. This would apply to their offspring and to their offspring's offspring forever. For instance, a shlomim's offering's offspring and a shlomim substitution are considered to be fully shlomim offerings and must be waved and leaned on and have libations. The Gemara says it specifies that a shlomim's offspring and its offspring, etc., forever are all shlomim, to specify that all animals born from the shlomim forever down are considered to be shlomims. That's then sourced. Now, when we say that a shlomim's offspring is considered sanctified, some say it's even sanctified fully to be offered on the altar in accordance with a particular unique opinion, while others hold it simply is left to graze until it develops a blemish. Further sources are quoted on this, including one which says that the substitution of an ola or shlomim and the offspring of a shlomim can be offered on the altar. Then specifically it says that there's a tradition that the Chatas is offspring of an offspring, and its substitution must be left to die, and we learn from a verse that if somebody impermissibly then offers this, that's a violation of a positive commandment. It quotes alternative opinions that prove we have tradition that the substitution of an asham cannot be offered either. It also sources that the offspring and substitution of a blemished animal can viably be offered. New Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer actually disagrees and says the offspring of a shlomim cannot be offered as a shlomim. The sages say it can. Specifically, they both agree that the grandchild of a shlomim is not a shlomim. They dispute by a regular offspring of a shlomim. Another sage testified in accordance with the sage's opinion. The Gemara says, our source for Rabbi Eliezer is simply that it's a rabbinic decree to prevent people from raising flocks of offspring shlomims, which could then potentially be impermissibly used. When we said that Rabbi Eliezer and the sages agree in regards to grandchildren of the shlomim, we initially said this means they agree they're not shlomim, but others actually say we agree that they are shlomim. It disputes between these opinions, and it mentions that a meiser offspring would not be offered. In regards to the particularly testified on case where it said the offspring of the animal was a shlomim, it's explained to refer to a shlomim that's being offered on the holiday of Shavuos based on the specific used words. New Mishnah. By the offspring of a toda or a substitution of a toda, their offspring and offspring of their offspring forever down are treated like a toda. Besides that, they're not brought with bread like the original one was. The Gemara spends some time sourcing this. New Mishnah. By the offspring of an ola or substitution of an ola, their offspring and the offspring of their offspring forever down are treated like an ola, meaning they're skinned and dismembered and are burnt entirely in fires. If a female animal is designated as an ola, which isn't allowed as it must be a male, if the animal gives birth to a male, the offspring is left to graze until it develops a blemish, it should be sold and the proceeds go to bring a new ola. Rabbi Eliezer says the offspring itself should just be offered as an ola. The Gemara says, at the end it was a dispute by the offspring of a female ola, but initially it was agreed its offspring is offered. So some just say the first half was just taught like the final opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and others say that the offspring is the regular ola if it's a female that was substituted for a male ola, which has a child, assuming the original offspring is also being brought. Now, elsewhere, this final opinion of Rabbi Eliezer says that the offspring of an ola should have their proceeds used to bring a new ola. However, he just said here that the offspring itself is an ola. So it's answered, he's either quoting the disagreeing opinion, or it's that the case is with the male offspring of the substitution of an asham, so the parent isn't even called an ola, so there, in that case, he'd concede the offspring isn't offered on the altar. Elsewhere, however, it's explained that Rabbi Eliezer holds, if a female animal is designated for a paschal offering and it wasn't offered and Passover ended, but it bore a male offspring over Passover, he'd say the offspring should be brought as a shlomim, evidently in spite of the fact that its parent is not a shlomim. So it's explained either that this is different, as the leftover paschal offering itself could be offered as a shlomim, or it's that the leftover offspring becomes a shlomim, so the offspring also could be a shlomim. Although others dispute this notion that the offspring gets the same status as its mother, as it said that if a female animal is designated as a paschal offering, it said that the offspring itself should also be brought as a paschal offering. So it explains this is just a unique case, as it was designated while it was pregnant, according to the opinion that the fetus does not have the same status as the mother, so while the mother could not be a proper paschal offering, as it's a female, the son can. However, it is said that Rabbi Eliezer would concede if somebody designates a female animal as an asham, its male child is not an asham. This is different from where the offspring of a female ola can be an ola, as it shares a title with its parent, not as it have the same gender, as a female asham cannot even have the same title of an asham. It didn't just only teach the case of an ola, as here the mother was actually sanctified here as an asham, so it needed to say the offspring here would not be a valid asham offering. New Mishnah. If somebody designated a female animal as an asham, it should be left to graze until it's blemished, and it should then be sold, and an asham should be brought with the proceeds. If the owner had already brought some other proper asham, some say the proceeds go to the voluntary communal offering, and others say the female asham should just be sold, even if it's not blemished. The Gemara says the reason this female asham is left to develop a blemish instead of it being enough that it's just incorrectly consecrated is as it has monetary sanctity, so therefore it should also have physical sanctity. Meaning if somebody consecrated a male sheep, a ram, for its monetary value, it is agreed it would then have physical sanctity. Now some say it should just be sold even without a blemish, as they'd hold it doesn't actually have physical sanctity as it's not fit to be offered as a sacrifice. A premature offering can be sanctified uniquely, as it's similar to the Bechor, as that's where its laws are derived from. Related, there's a dispute. If somebody consecrates a female animal as his ola or a paschal offering or an asham, which must be a male, those can be substituted. Rabbi Shimon says this can only be done with the ola, as an offering can only be substituted if it would need to be left to graze to be blemished. Rebbe would say then the paschal offering would also be left to be substituted, as if it's a leftover, it becomes a shlamim. This would not then apply by an asham, as he holds a leftover asham goes to a communal offering, which cannot be substituted. So according to Rabbi Shimon, by a Kohen Gadol's bull chatas, if a female cow was brought, that doesn't get physical sanctity, as if it's brought as a red heifer, such an animal is consecrated for temple upkeep, and substitutions don't come from there. And if a he-goat was brought instead of the proper she-goat chatas, there is the variation by the Nasi's he-goat, but there's no comparison as those are brought by different people, so it would not acquire physical sanctity. And if somebody brought a he-goat instead of a she-goat, and then he actually became the actual Nasi, the prior still wasn't physically sanctified, as he hadn't actually sinned to need to bring the Nasi's he-goat, which is clarified, and it discusses some additional principles on this. New Mishnah. By the substitution of an asham offering and the offspring of the actual substitution and its offspring forever down, those should be left to graze until they develop a blemish, and should then be sold for the voluntary communal offering. Others just say they should be left to die, while others hold an ola should be brought with the proceeds. An asham whose owner died, or if the owner was atoned through some other different asham, this asham should be left to graze until it gets a blemish, and it should then be sold for the voluntary communal offering. And others say it should be left to die, and others say the proceeds should be used to buy an ola. Now, the first opinion said we should bring a voluntary communal offering, which is literally also just an ola, but there's a difference. A regular ola must have semicha, meaning libations, which are brought from its funds, and if the owner was a Kohen, he can do the service and receive its tithe. If it was a voluntary communal offering, none of these apply. There's no leaning, the libations are brought from communal funds, and the service and tithe go to the current Mishmar watch. The Gemara says it repeats these principles by the substitution of an asham and its offspring, and by the asham whose owner died, to show everybody maintains their respective opinions in all of these cases. Although it is clarified that it is agreed that if the asham has already been offered and atonement occurred, the substitution's offspring itself should be offered as an ola. However, others say that this is essentially just a second generation offspring which cannot be offered, so that's unresolved. If somebody designated a female animal as an asham, if it has male offspring, it's disputed if that child is offered as an ola, as the mother does not share the title of ola. However, some say that the offspring can still be an ola, as both the mother and the son are valid to be offered for something, as the mother can still be an asham. Now, elsewhere it does say that by a substitution's offspring and its offspring forever down, an ola should be brought with their proceeds, meaning they themselves cannot be an ola. So it suggests this could work if the animal gave birth to a female, and then apparently every single one of its descendants forever after was a female. So not one of them could be an ola, or more reasonably, is just a rabbinic institution to prevent people from doing the same by an asham. New Mishnah. By the substitution of a firstborn animal and animal meiser, their offspring and their offspring's offspring forever down are like the original firstborn and meiser, and are eaten in a blemished state by their owners. There's some differences between blemished bechor and meisers, and all other blemished offerings, which is a repeating point from chapter 5 of Tractate Temurah. By all typical offerings, if they're blemished, they can be sold and slaughtered in markets, and they're weighed against a literal weight, they can be redeemed, and their substitutes can be redeemed, and all of this does not apply by the Bechor and Meiser tithes. Also, regular offerings can be brought from outside of Israel, while Bechor and Meisers are not. If Bechors and Meisers are brought from outside of Israel, if they're not blemished, they're offered on the altar, and if they are blemished, they're eaten by their owners as is. The difference is, as Bechors and Meisers lose their consecration upon being blemished, unlike by regular offerings. The Gemara says, if somebody blemishes a substitution of a firstborn or a Meiser animal, or possibly on the 9th counted Meiser animal, as neither of those are offered on the altar, it questions if there's lashes for blemishing those. There's some quoted variation. Now, it's actually a dispute as to if Bechoros from outside of Israel are offered on the altar. It also sources scripturally the fact that eating Meiser Sheni in Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple is prohibited, which is additionally discussed further. This would apply to ban the consumption of the Bechor, which it also sources from a specific case. And then it said that this principle of Meiser Sheni could be derived from the Bechor. This is permitted as Meiser Sheni is not considered to be consecrated, so it could be derived in this manner. It additionally discusses this comparison between these two types of offerings, proving that Meiser Sheni is only eaten within Jerusalem, or possibly even outside, within sight of the walls, while a Bechor must actually be eaten inside of the city itself. It discusses the necessity for some additional verses. And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Temurah covers the various laws of the Chatas atonement. The first Mishnah says, the Chatas sin offerings, offspring, and substitution, or a Chatas whose owner died, these animals are then left to die. If there's a Chatas and a year has passed without it being offered, or a Chatas that was lost and then found with a blemish, if the owner atoned with a different Chatas, the original is left to die and cannot be substituted. it would be a prohibition to benefit from it, although there's no actual penalty of me'ilah. If the owner did not atone through some other chatas, the original should just be left to graze until it develops a blemish, it should be sold, and then a new offering should be brought with the proceeds. It could be substituted, and it is subject to me'ilah. The Gemara says it lists the first 3 chatas cases that are left to die in one ruling, and then the last 2 separately. This is as the last cases aren't as clear-cut. Also, this entire Mishnah will be repeated in the later Tractate Me'ilah as it discusses offering substitutions and also the laws of Me'ilah, so it's relevant to both. If a chatas has been left for a year, it's viewed as if it's standing in a cemetery, so it can't be accessed by a Kohen, meaning it's just left to graze. This would be unlike a chatas that was lost and later found to be blemished, where it would be simply left to die. Others reject this and explain that the animal is left to die if it was lost, meaning if it's then found to be blemished, or if a year passed, it's left to die, to show that both of these are entirely disqualifying factors if it gets lost. This would be different than a chatas that was just lost at night, where it's not considered to be lost, as in that period it couldn't be used for anything. However, we ask, by the Yom Kippur offering, by the he-goats, if one died and a replacement is brought, the remainder is not left to die, and it needs to become blemished and sold for the communal fund. The implication is that as this is not left to die, so too by a personal chatas, if a different one is brought, the first should be left to die. So it's explained there's a difference between rejected and lost chatas. As with a lost chatas, the owner still thinks to offer them, hoping that they'll be found, but by a rejected chatas, that doesn't exist. Now, when we said that a chatas lost by night isn't considered to be lost, this is in accordance with the opinion that holds a chatas lost at the time to designate a replacement would be left to die, and he's saying that this would not apply by night, even though the new chatas took its place in the meanwhile. Or alternatively, it hadn't even been replaced, and it's saying that it's not left to die, as the loss occurred at night, even though it remained lost during the day. There's also a tradition that a lost chatas category does not include a stolen chatas offering. If a chatas just got mixed up with a bunch of animals, some say it's considered to be lost, others say it's just considered to be hidden behind the door, and it's unresolved as to what that exactly means. If the animal is lost from both the owner and the shepherd, but there's some random third person who recognized the animal, it's unresolved if it's considered to be lost there. If a chatas was lost after the blood reception but before the service, according to the opinion that a lost chatas is left to die, if it's lost by the time of atonement, that too would stand unresolved. New Mishnah. If somebody designated a chatas and it was lost, and he then offered a new chatas, and then the original chatas was found, it's left to die. If somebody designated money for a chatas and lost the coins, so he offered a new chatas and the original money was found, it should be disposed of by throwing it into the Dead Sea. If somebody designated money for a chatas and it was lost, so he designated new money, and then he found the original money before making any new purchases, he should bring a chatas from both funds, and the remainder should go to the voluntary communal ola donation fund. If somebody designated money for a chatas and lost it, and then designated a new chatas but he hadn't offered it, and he found the first money, but the chatas got blemished, the blemished chatas should be sold. So now he has 2 sets of funds, which should be used to purchase a chatas, and the remainder goes to the voluntary communal ola offering donation fund. If somebody designates a chatas and then loses it, and then he designates money for a new chatas, but the original chatas was found, but it's blemished, it should be sold, and both of these funds should be used to buy a new chatas, and the remainder goes to the voluntary communal ola donation fund. If somebody designated a chatas and it was lost, so he designates a new chatas animal, and before it's offered he finds the original and both are blemished, they should both be sold and the funds go to a chatas and the remainder goes to the voluntary communal ola donation fund. If somebody designated a chatas and it was lost and he designated a replacement, and before it's offered the original is found and both are unblemished and fit to be offered, Rebbe says one should be offered and the other should be left to die, and the sages say this would only occur if one chatas had already been used when the original was found, and the designated chatas money is only thrown out if it was found after the owner brought a chatas. Lastly, if somebody designates a chatas and it gets a blemish, he sells it and buys a new chatas with the proceeds. Some say if the replacement was offered before the first one was eaten by its new owner, the first one must be left to die as the original owner atoned through a replacement of it. The Gemara disputes the author of this. It's explained it goes between Rebbe and the sages, as there's 2 variations of what they dispute. Either they agree that if somebody found the lost chatas before any atonement, and one was offered, the second is left to die, which fits like our Mishnah. However, others say it means that they agree that if the lost chatas is found, the owner atones with the new replacement, and the lost chatas is left to die, and they debate where somebody atones with the original, as they dispute if the replacement has the same status as the original, so they'd have to just explain that the first part of the Mishnah follows the opinion of the sages, and the latter part follows the opinion of Rebbe. Some clarify this latter opinion to only debate where the man asked of a court what to do, as some would allow a resolution for such a situation by permitting atonement with the original Chatas offering. There's further discussion on this, disputing as to whether we rule that the replacement Chatas has the exact same status as the original. That's additionally discussed. Now, if somebody designated 2 piles of money as insurance for each other for a Chatas, and he atoned through one of them, the other goes to the voluntary communal fund. This is uniquely according to the opinion that Chatas money never goes to the voluntary communal fund, as he's saying this is specifically an exception, even as 2 funds were designated. Similarly, if 2 animals were designated as insurance for each other as chatases, one is used to atone and the other is left to graze. This would be according to Rebbe, who says a chatas would have normally been left to die, but here, as it's 2 chatas being insurance for each other, the remaining one is just left to graze. It disputes this from some particular cases. If a chatas was lost at the time of designating a replacement, and it was found before the replacement was offered, according to Rebbe, it's just left to die, and according to the sages, it's left to graze. If it was lost at the time of atonement, it's agreed it's left to die. Related, it was discussed in Tractate Temurah, but it said that a blemished Bechor offering that was redeemed and slaughtered for eating cannot be skinned from the feet. This is according to those that hold the principle that the meat of a slaughtered blemished animal is forbidden as a chatas if the owner was atoned through some other chatas. It cannot be attributed to others who hold there's a difference by the Bechor as it's automatically sanctified in the womb, or that the Bechor's sanctity is lower as it can't be redeemed for money. Blemished offerings after redemption can be sold in the market, but they still cannot be skinned from the feet, as while that would make the hide nicer, it would lessen the value of the meat, which is disrespectful. Other reasons skinning a blemished offering from the feet is prohibited is as it appears like somebody's doing work with the offering, and also it's prohibited rabbinically out of concern people will then keep disqualified offerings around to sell their hides and eventually impermissibly come to benefit from them. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Tractate Temurah continues covering the various laws of temple offerings, now on some unique designations. The first Mishnah says, as has been discussed, a firstborn animal is given to the Kohanim as the Bechor tithe. If somebody wants, if he has a pregnant animal, he can preemptively designate it, assuming it's a male, as an olah, and it could then be offered as an olah. Or he can preemptively designate it, assuming it's a female, as a shlomim. Or he can say, if it's a male, it'll be an olah, and if it's a female, it'll be a shlomim. And if he does this, and it gives birth to both a male and a female, the male is an olah and the female is a shlomim. If 2 males were born, one is an olah and the other is sold to somebody who needs to bring an olah, and he can just keep the proceeds himself. If 2 females are born, one is a shlomim and the other is sold to somebody who needs to bring a shlomim, and he can keep the proceeds. If a tumtum or androgynous were born, some say they cannot be sanctified due to their doubtful status. The Gemara says an opinion that it's allowed to blemish a firstborn before it's born to exempt it from the Bechor tithe. This would only be allowed, unlike our Mishnah, nowadays, when there's no temple to offer the animal anyways. This is preferable in spite of the concern that he might accidentally blemish it after it's born, because having an actual Bechor animal tithe is problematic as it can't be offered anywhere, but it also can't be used, which could cause issues. We said somebody could declare a pregnant animal's child preemptively as a shlomim if it's a female, which is relevant if the mother is consecrated. It has little to do with the firstborn at all, as that only applies to firstborn males. Then by the latter case, with the animal having 2 males, this goes back to the mother not being consecrated, as otherwise the child will just be an olah also, like its mother. The fact that the tumtum and androgynous aren't just sanctified from their mother is evidently, as this opinion holds, they'll only be sanctified after they're born, which wouldn't work due to the animal's doubtful status. However, there's some issues with this, as we prove from elsewhere that consecrated animals' offspring are consecrated from their mother's womb, although it is agreed a firstborn is only sanctified through its actual birth, meaning if it's declared that when its majority emerged it'll be an olah, would it be an olah or a bechor? That's asked. It's compared to somebody who is harvesting grain and he declared about fallen stalks, which must be donated to charity, as the leket charity, that as they fall from majority of his hand, they become ownerless. So clearly God's commandment takes precedent and they nevertheless are still charity stalks. So too, by the animal birth, its Bechor sanctity takes precedent. New Mishnah. If somebody declares a pregnant animal's fetus as an olah and the mother as a shlomim, that's valid. If he declared the mother as a shlomim and the fetus as an olah, in that reversed order, Rabbi Meir says the offspring is also a shlomim as its mother is, while Rabbi Yossi says if he intended to say both parts initially, they both take effect. But if he just said the mother is a shlomim and then considered and then he added afterwards the fetus is an olah, the fetus is still a shlomim. The Gemara says, if somebody designated a pregnant goat as a chatas and she gave birth to a female kid, he can atone with the mother or with the offspring, whichever he wants. This is as he holds a fetus is separate from its mother, so if the mother is consecrated, the fetus would also be, as it's like consecrating two animals as insurance for each other, unless you otherwise specify that this shouldn't occur. So some interpret the wording of our Mishnah to be in accordance with this, although it additionally debates this opinion from some laws of emancipation and some similar principles. Alternatively, it suggests the reason this opinion holds that a person can atone through the Chatas or its offspring is as it's an improvement of the consecrated mother animal, although that's disputed as this opinion didn't actually use this answer. When we said the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, that if somebody designated a mother animal as a shlomim and then considered and designated a fetus as an ola, the fetus is a shlomim. This is to say that he cannot reconsider even in less than the time it takes to make an utterance. New Mishnah. Rabbi Meir says, if somebody declares an animal to be a substitution for an ola, a substitution for a shlomim, it's only a substitution for an ola. Rabbi Yossi says, if he intended these simultaneously, they both take effect, and the animal is now half ola and half shlomim, although that wouldn't work anyways, it would have to be left to get a blemish. If he only intended the first statement, then considered and then said the second, it's only a substitution for an ola. The Gemara says, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi agree that if somebody said the ola substitution should take effect, and then the shlomim substitution should take effect, only the first one does. And if he said the ola substitution should only take effect if the shlomim substitution takes effect, both are substituted. They disagree about the case of the Mishnah, as Rabbi Meir says, he should have said a substitution for an ola and a shlomim. While Rabbi Yossi says what he said is fine, and it means he's substituting for both. Related, if somebody declared half an animal as an ola substitution and half as a shlomim substitution, Rabbi Meir says it'd be an ola, and Rabbi Yossi again says it goes by his intent. If he intended both, then both take effect. It says they hold similar opinions by an animal that is designated as half an ola and half a chatas. Again, Rabbi Meir saying we go by the first statement, Rabbi Yossi saying that they combine, and by an animal that's designated as half an ola and half a shlomim, according to Rabbi Yossi, both take effect and it cannot be offered. But it could be substituted, and the substitute would have the same unofferable status. Related, it said if an animal is owned by two partners and one man consecrates half and then buys and consecrates the other half, it's all consecrated but cannot be offered. However, it can be substituted, and the substitute cannot be offered also. This essentially implies three things: that something that's invalid while it only has monetary sanctity is permanently rejected, that living things can be permanently rejected from the altar, and that initial rejection is permanent rejection. Similarly, if an animal is designated as an ola offering and half as the maaser tithe, everybody, even Rabbi Yossi, would agree it's just an ola. If it's half teruma tithe and half maaser tithe, that's unresolved. New Mishnah. If somebody declared his animal as in place of this offering, or the substitute of this offering, or the exchange of this offering, that would be a valid substitution. If he said this offering is deconsecrated onto this animal, that's not a proper substitution. But if that offering then became blemished, it would become deconsecrated and it would switch to be replaced, although he'd need to add money to adjust to the difference in value. The Gemara says the expression in place of is valid to substitute an offering, and as seen elsewhere, it's also valid to deconsecrate an offering. It can mean both. However, if somebody wants to say this while deconsecrating a blemished animal, he'd need to have his hand on the actual consecrated blemished animal. Now, if somebody had two animals that were blemished offerings and two regular unblemished animals, and he said these two regular animals are in place of the two offerings, do we assume that he meant to do the forbidden act of substitution, meaning he'd get lashes? And if we assume he just properly deconsecrate the blemished animal, if somebody had two animal offerings and one was blemished, and two regular animals and one was blemished, and he said these two regular animals are in place of the two offerings, do we assume he meant to deconsecrate the unblemished animal to the unblemished animal, or vice versa, in which case that's prohibited substitution? And if we say we assume here he's doing the permissible thing, if somebody had three animal offerings and one was blemished and three unblemished regular animals, and he says these three regular animals are in place of the three offerings, do we assume he just meant to do this with the permitted blemished offering, or is he also impermissibly substituting the regular animals? And if we assume he's doing the permissible thing, what if somebody had four offerings and one was blemished, and he had four regular animals, and he said these four regular animals are in place of the four offerings? Do we assume he's properly just deconsecrating the blemished animal, and all of these just go unresolved? We said if the consecrated animal that was deconsecrated onto another became blemished, it would actually deconsecrate itself onto the other animal. This is a biblical concept, but there's a dispute if the monetary readjustment is a biblical or a rabbinic principle. This debate would be where the discrepancy is over a sixth, where the principle is that such an overcharge would typically void a sale. Although there's variation as to who holds which way, or perhaps some just say that any discrepancy with consecrated property needs to be adjusted by biblical law. This adjustment is only where the amount was originally assessed by 2 people. If it was assessed by 3 originally, no matter how many people reassess it, it's not reversed. He doesn't hold we go majority here, as he says it's rabbinic, so it's treated more leniently. New Mishnah, if somebody declared an animal to be in place of an olah or in place of a chatas without specifying a particular offering, there's no substitution. If he said in place of this olah or this chatas, referring to a specific offering, or in place of a chatas or an olah that's in his house, meaning it's not actually in front of him, that all would be effective. Similarly, if somebody declares a non-kosher or blemished animal as an olah, that's not effective. If he said it's for an olah, it should be sold and the proceeds are then used to purchase an olah. The Gemara says, this disagrees with Rabbi Meir, who says a person does not make a declaration in vain. Further, if the non-kosher animal or blemished animal are declared for an olah, they're sold and have an olah purchased. If a female animal was designated for an asham or an olah, it needs to get a blemish before it's sold for an olah, which is unlike a disagreeing opinion. And that's the end of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Tractate Temurah continues on the laws of temple offerings, now on principles of forbidden mixtures. The first Mishnah says, if an animal is prohibited to be offered on the temple altar, whether because it was used for bestiality, if it was designated for an idolatrous offering, if it was worshipped, if it was paid to a harlot or exchanged for a dog, if it's a hybrid, if it has a defect, or if it was born via C-section, if it's mixed with any other offerings, they become invalid. An animal designated for an idol, in that case, the animal is prohibited, but its adornments are fine. If the animal was worshipped for an idol, it and its adornments are prohibited. Both of these variants are allowed to be eaten. The Gemara says, we're essentially ruling that a forbidden animal isn't nullified by being mixed with any amount of offerings, and they're all prohibited. However, in Tractate Temurah on 70b, it essentially says the exact same thing. So as explained, it's repeating this as here, we're discussing animals that were not consecrated when they were mixed, while Zevachim discusses offerings that mix with other offerings. A similar principle was stated that items, when mixed with idols or similar, are prohibited in Tractate Avodah Zarah on 74a. So it's repeating this, and it's explained the differences here. These animals themselves are permitted for benefit, so there's a difference. The fact that an animal that was used for bestiality cannot be offered is then sourced, including a scriptural derivation. That's additionally discussed further, sourcing the remaining prohibitions. It also suggests some alternative sources. Some qualify an animal designated for idol worship to refer to one that was designated as an idol for 7 years, assuming it wasn't actually worshipped, as then it would just be a worshipped animal. It sources this from some principles regarding Gideon destroying his father's idols, although it said his father's 7-year designated bull had also been uniquely worshipped. There's dispute as to when an animal designated for an idol is no longer considered to be idolatrous. Some say until it's been used for something normal, others say until they feed it animal food to prepare it to be eaten. The animal being used for a normal act would be something like shearing or working with it, and then spend some time sourcing the fact that an offering that was actually worshipped as an idol is prohibited for use as a temple offering. New Mishnah. Now to define a harlot's wage. If somebody tells a harlot to take a lamb as her wage, even if there are 100 lambs, they're all forbidden, which will be clarified. Or if somebody tells a person to take his lamb and let his slave cohabit with his slave, it's a dispute if that constitutes a harlot's wage. The Gemara says, the case is where the man gave her 100 lambs for the wage, but she only took one. In that case, they're all considered to be part of the wage and are forbidden. It said if the man gave her an animal for payment and then cohabited with her later on, or he cohabited with her and then later on paid her, that would not be a harlot's wage. This would be assuming she offered the animal before he cohabited with her, so it doesn't become a harlot's wage retroactively. This could be possible if he said she could preemptively acquire the animal before the actual act of cohabitation if she needed it. Related, if somebody only consecrated it an animal wage and then did the cohabitation with a harlot, that's different, as it's only consecrated, it's not actually offered, so that just goes unresolved. When we said if the man cohabits with her and then later pays her with an animal, that animal could be offered. That's only if he said cohabit with me for a lamb, not for this lamb. This would be where it's either a non-Jewish woman who doesn't need to formally acquire the animal, or it's a Jewish woman and the lamb was in her courtyard when this was said, so she acquires it, and it was designated to repay a debt. Further, to define a harlot's wage, this would even include somebody who paid for cohabitation towards a man or a relative. It's argued that if it would include a payment towards one's wife who's a nida at that time, which is disputed. It said if a Kohen cohabits with a non-Jewish woman, he does not get lashes, as his offspring there aren't attributed to him, but if a Kohen cohabited with a Jewish harlot, he would get lashes, as his offspring would be attributed to him in that case. If a regular person cohabited with a Jewish harlot, the payment could actually still be valid as an offering, as this could be an act of betrothal. Others disagree and say there's just no difference at all between a Jewish woman and a non-Jewish woman. that their wages are prohibited for offerings, and a Kohen gets lashes for cohabiting with either of them. This is as these laws are derived from each other, and it additionally disputes between these opinions. The debate if somebody takes a lamb to have his slave reproduce with another, if that's prohibited as an offering, is where it's a Canaanite slave woman and a Hebrew slave who has no wife or children, wherein it would be prohibited for them to be made to reproduce. New Mishnah. To define a dog exchange, somebody says to another to take a lamb in exchange for his dog. That lamb cannot be brought as an offering. Or if two partners divide 19 lambs and a dog, so one ended up with 10 lambs and the other got 9 lambs and the dog, the 10 lambs that were taken against the dog are prohibited while the 9 lambs are fine. Now, a dog's wage, as opposed to this, which is a dog's exchange, or a harlot's exchange, as opposed to a harlot's wage, would be permitted. A harlot's wage and a dog exchange's offspring are permitted. The Gemara sources the definition of the concept of exchanging the dog for an animal that refers to an exchange, not a payment. By the division of 20 animals, this is where the dog's value is greater than each one of the 10 individual lambs, which is why each is to some extent being exchanged for the dog, as they share the excess. The remaining principles are sourced. According to some, offspring of a pregnant animal used for bestiality is forbidden, as it and its offspring are both considered as if bestiality was done with them. Offspring of a pregnant animal that gored is forbidden, as the offspring is also considered to have gored. This would not apply by an animal used by idol worship, as the offspring had nothing to do with that. Some say they're still prohibited, as the idol worshippers prefer the cow to be pregnant. It's forbidden to benefit from the waste of an animal used for idolatry, but it's permitted to benefit from the waste of a cow designated to be stoned. This is either based on scriptural verses, or simply as by the idol-worshipped cow, they prefer it when it was swollen due to the waste. New Mishnah. If somebody gives a harlot coins for her wage, these can be permissibly used to buy offerings. If wine, oil, or flour were given, or similar, those cannot be used. If you gave her consecrated items, they can be used. If you gave her unconsecrated birds, they cannot be used. This is then sourced from a verse. Also, animals that are prohibited to be offered because of idol worship or bestiality, their offspring are permitted as offerings, but the offspring of an animal with a defect would be prohibited. Some even say an animal that nursed from one with a defect would be prohibited as an offering. Any consecrated animal that has a defect cannot be redeemed, as it would only be allowed to be redeemed if it was to feed humans, but here it can't anyways be eaten as it has a defect. The Gemara says there's a dispute if wheat kernels are paid to a harlot, or grapes, if she then makes those into wheat or wine, if they're permitted or prohibited to be offered, as to whether this includes these substances' changed forms. Some say the red heifer is excluded from this, as it's not offered in the temple. Some say the gold plates used to cover the altar are prohibited if they're used as a harlot's wage, as some even say if gold is paid to our harlot, it cannot be used anywhere in the temple. We said if an already consecrated item was given to her, it's permitted. That's then sourced. There's actually a dispute if the offspring of prohibited animals are permitted or not. As we mentioned earlier, some consider the fetus to be part of the mother, so if the mother gore was used in bestiality, it's considered like the fetus did so too. There's variation again quoted on this. It is agreed that a chick hatched from the egg of a defected bird is forbidden, as they would agree that a bird where the egg definitely comes from the mother's own body, that would definitely have the same status as its mother. It would support for this. Additionally, we said that according to some, an animal that nursed from an animal with a defect is disqualified. This is explained to be if it nursed fresh milk for every moment of its life, so its entire growth and current existence is due to the defected animal. Lastly, we said that any consecrated animal that gets a defect cannot be redeemed, and it quotes the scriptural source for this. And that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7, the final chapter of Tractate Temurah, finishes on the laws of offerings and consecration. The first Mishnah says, there's differences between things consecrated to the altar and things consecrated to temple upkeep. Things consecrated to the temple altar can be substituted, and there could be liability for improper intent, leftovers, and eating while impure. Their offspring and milk are prohibited even once they're redeemed. There's liability for slaughtering them outside the temple. They're not paid to the temple craftsman as their fee, and none of these apply by things consecrated towards temple upkeep. If something is unspecified in its consecration, it goes to temple upkeep. Temple upkeep sanctity can take effect on anything, even rocks or wood. There's me'ilo liability from benefiting from what grows from them, and the Kohanim get no portion of these. The Gemara says all of this applies to animals specifically, as temple bird and flower offerings cannot actually be substituted, and it's like the opinion that the child of a sacrificial offering can be substituted, and it's only discussing primary offerings, which is why I didn't mention that a substituted animal cannot be substituted, which actually just answers all of the earlier issues. It sources that unlike things consecrated to the altar, items in temple upkeep can actually be paid to the temple craftsman. It sources the opinion which holds that unspecified consecrations go to temple upkeep, as others actually disagree with this and say that they become ola offerings. Others say this applies only if the entire consecrated flock are all males, and if there's a mixture of males and females, Some say they go to temple upkeep, others say the males are olas and the females are sold to purchase olas. There's variation of this conversation quoted. When we said temple upkeep sanctity takes effect on everything, that includes sawdust and fallen leaves. When we said there's me'ilah for benefiting from things that grow from temple upkeep items, that includes milk or eggs of consecrated animals or birds. Some say this would also apply by things consecrated to the altar, but that it only apply if the things that grow are fit to be offered themselves. That me'ilah would apply. New Mishnah. Animals consecrated to the altar and to the temple upkeep both cannot be switched to the other type of sanctity. By animals consecrated to the altar, if their appraisal is consecrated, that could go to temple upkeep. And you can also make the value of an object a cherem vow, a vow of donation to the temple. If a consecrated animal died, it must be buried, although some say if it was from temple upkeep, it could be redeemed after it dies. The Gemara says, according to some, if animals are consecrated to the altar and the owner re-consecrated them as kohanic cherem donations, this is ineffective. Although it quotes a source which lists prohibited re-consecrations, and this isn't on the list, and it says perhaps it just doesn't say it because not that it holds that they're ineffective, but because it's only discussing cases where there are two instances of ineffective consecration. Anyways, issue is our Mishnah said that an altar consecration can be switched to a consecration of appraisal, and it can be a cherem vow, which clearly refers to kohanic cherem, so that completely refutes that opinion. Although it does additionally discuss how he sourced that in the first place. It was also said if somebody consecrated an olah for temple upkeep, it's ineffective. This is explained to apply biblically. Rabbinically, he would still need to pay it. Anyways, it quoted additional views as to where we dispute whether offerings for temple upkeep and for altars are stood and evaluated between further opinions. These are additionally discussed and sourced, and many views on this are refuted. There are further points on this. New Mishnah. The following must be buried. If a consecrated animal miscarried, the miscarriage would be buried. Afterbirth would be buried. A stoned ox and a decapitated eglah arufa calf would be buried. Birds of a mitzora, the cut hair of a nazir, a firstborn male donkey tithe, meat cooked with milk, and unconsecrated animals slaughtered in the temple courtyard would all be buried. Others disagree and say that those last ones must be burned. The following must be burned: chametz, leaven on Passover, impure terumah tithes, arla, under 3-year-old fruits, and forbidden plant mixtures of a vineyard. Some say by these last two that dry food is burnt and liquids are buried. The Kohanim can permissibly benefit from impure terumah tithes by kindling a fire with their bread and oil. If an offering was slaughtered with improper intent of time or location, it must be burned. An unneeded asham taloi offering is burnt, although some say it's buried. A doubtful bird chatas is burned, although others say it's disposed in a stream. All things that are buried cannot be burned, and anything that's burned cannot be buried. Others disagree and say it's permitted to be stringent and burn items that are supposed to be buried, but others say it's not good to deviate in this. The Gemara says, we said here we bury nazir here. This is where it's impure, as elsewhere it says it should be burned, but that's where it's pure. Others say ours discusses hair, while there it discusses hair and sackcloth, which is additionally held by others. That they say the hair and the cloth must be burned, and it's not just nullified as it's significant, so it's explained to be allowed to be stringent and it could be burnt. It clarifies that on Passover, leaven is burnt, according to those that say chametz is disposed of only through burning. To also clarify, impure terumah and arla fruits, if they're solid, they're burnt, and if they're liquid, they're buried. We said some hold a doubtful bird chatas is burned, some say it's dumped into a stream, which would involve cutting it into separate pieces first. The reason there's a difference between things buried and burnt is if something's buried, its ashes would be forbidden for benefit, so it can't be burnt. It explains a particular few relevant exceptions. However, things that are burned can have their ashes be benefited from. However, we see from elsewhere that the ashes of something consecrated are forbidden, so it's explained that that either refers to a fire that happened to burn consecrated wood, so there's nobody that deconsecrated this wood, so it would be forbidden, or it refers specifically to the separation of ash from the altar in the morning that was placed on the courtyard floor beside the altar, which maintains its sanctity, and uniquely can still not be benefited from. And that's the end of chapter 7, and the entire Tractate Temurah. Alright, that was a lot of information, so here's a rough summary of a lot of the practical takeaways from this tractate. If an offering was designated in the temple, it could be substituted onto a different animal. This wasn't actually permitted, but laws did apply if it was done. And that's about everything. Thank you so much for watching.